Hello and welcome to this Intelligence Squared event with Anthony Sattin. He is an author, journalist and broadcaster who has written highly acclaimed books on history and travel, including Young Lawrence, A Winter on the Nile, The Pharaoh's Shadow, The Gates of Africa and Lifting the Veil. He's also a contributing editor to Condé Nast Traveller, editorial advisor on Geographical magazine and a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. His latest book is Nomads, The Wanderers Who Shaped Our World, and that is what we're going to discuss tonight. Tonight's event will run for 1 hour. For the first 40 minutes or so, I'm going to be in conversation with Anthony, and then we're going to turn to your questions. You can start asking them now by clicking on the Ask Question button under the video screen and typing in your question. If you want your name to be mentioned, please type it into the box and then press send. And a reminder that you should, it'd be great if you could tweet using the hashtag IQ2. Let's turn to the book. Humans have been on the move for most of history. Even after the great urban advancement lured people into the cities, most of humanity continued to live lightly on the move and outside the pages of history. Recent discoveries have started to reveal the impact on our history these people had and how much settled people have learned from those on the move. Anthony, what I wanted to start with was addressing why you think contemporary historians have overlooked nomadic populations so much and why it's so important to address this balance.
Well, firstly, I don't think it's just contemporary historians. I think it's all historians have missed the nomadic element in our story. And the reason for it is, well, there's several reasons. One of them is quite simple, and that is nomads have not generally kept records. So it's, even if you wanted to write the history, and I know this from personal experience, having written this book, it's very, very difficult to commission. But there's a great line from an Oxford and Princeton historian describing history as a path picked through ruins, and it's very evocative. It sort of talks about it invokes sort of something like a highway of history, and it starts with early monuments, and it comes through to the great skyscrapers and things of today. And this is the point I started with. I thought, well, but that means there's no place for nomads unless they are, because they tend not to build monuments, unless they're the ones who destroyed those monuments, which means that in our conventional histories, nomads are generally presented as the destroyers. And that's, well, it's just not true. And there's a reason for doing this now, this book. I mean, I think we're living in such an interesting period of history. I mean, I'm not naturally a historian. I'm not an academic. I don't have a chair in history, of nomadic history at Oxford or something. But I by this omission, and the more I looked into it, I mean, there are, of course, some serious books on the nomad empires of the Central Asian steppes, and and obviously lots of books on the Aborigines and nomads in Africa. But as a general history, as a sort of as a broad sweep, it's simply not there. And I thought, well, that's extraordinary and wonderful, and I therefore have to write it.
There's a fascinating study right at the end of the book that you discuss about babies and the importance and sort of how ingrained walking actually is in all of us. I wondered if you could tell us about that research. I think I was probably particularly interested, as I have a young son who was only while being carried, as I walked. So I thought this Sure. particularly resonated with me, but it's really interesting.
Well, it's great because this does come right at the very end. So good. I was holding you to the end of the book. Yes, it's research that was actually done in the 60s and 70s in London into the effect of movement on children, on babies. And it was discovered that, a baby left to scream on its own, a heartbeat will get up to about 200 beats a minute. And if you pick it up and as a parent, you and I both know this, you pick it up and start rocking it from side to side, it will calm down a bit. What the research discovered was that if you rock it at 60 beats a minute, the heartbeat will come, well, firstly, it'll stop crying, and the heartbeat will come right down. And also that if you tilt the angle slightly, then also the baby will calm. And the inference from this is that this is a sort of throwback from a time, some sort of muscle we have, memory muscle we have of a time when we were all living on the move. And therefore, when you were a baby and you were strapped to your mother's back and she was on the move, you were safe. And you were moving, which meant you were in a pack, and therefore you were doubly safe, and therefore you could stop crying, and because crying is a panic response. So yes, that's and it ties into something else I write about in the book, which is research that was done in the States more recently into genetic variants, and these researchers from Northwestern University in the States discovered one particular variant of a gene that they identified in successful nomads in a tribe in East Africa. And obviously there are more successful than others. And these were nomads who were leading the tribe, who were better fed, who had larger families because they could afford to look after them. And they found this same variant in children who were diagnosed with learning disorder in the United States, with attention deficit disorder. And they're scientists, so they obviously were reluctant to make the obvious conclusion, and that is that there's a link between these two, and that maybe these children are simply not or succeeding because they're in the wrong place. And so to put them in a classroom is maybe not to bring out the best in them. If you put them into a different environment, and maybe into a nomadic environment, that they would thrive. And the suggestion behind that is that 12,000 years ago, which is where my book opens, we all lived on the move. And our brains ourselves were programmed in a completely different way. We needed different skills and different instincts and different responses. And now, more than 50% of us live in urban environments. And obviously there's a huge toll on ourselves to live in that way. And 12,000 years in the human story is but yesterday. So that maybe many of us have simply not reprogrammed.
Of course, there are actually still some nomadic populations today, and you start the book in the Zagros Mountains in Iran, watching the annual migration of a tribe there. One thing you say is that a sort of universal issue for nomadic people is that governments put pressure on them to settle. Could you just explore what those pressures are and why they come sort of so into conflict with how essentially us settled people live our lives?
Well, there's on a governmental level. I've seen this all over the Middle East, which is where I've spent a lot of my adult life. And people who move around and have no fixed abode are very difficult to control. And so they're very often, stories in Syria, I heard that all the Bedouin women were prostitutes. In Egypt, you hear that the Bedouin men are smuggling drugs, or in Libya, they're smuggling arms, or which they may well have been actually recently. But there's always some sort of negative thing associated. And so governments also like to tax people, and so they hold out these twin carrots for the young and the old, and that is, if you want to educate your child, and if you're living in the 21st century, you generally do, then you're going to have to put your child into school. And so, for instance, with the nomads, the Bakhtiari that I write about at the beginning of the book in the Zagros Mountains in Iran, the whole family doesn't have to stop moving, but the children are put into a government-sponsored boarding school. So that's one side of it. And the other side is for the elderly. You want health care, you need to be effectively sort of signed up with a doctor, with a clinic. And therefore, again, it's another way of getting people to settle and control them. But it's interesting because there are some places, obviously, where it's in the government's interest to have people still moving. So, for instance, in Iran, there is a ministry that looks after nomadic affairs, and there are still a lot of nomads, simply because the landscape simply doesn't allow for much agriculture. It's a very, very harsh. It's either mountains or it's desert, most of Iran. And so for most of Iranian history, Persian history, the people who lived there were nomadic. And I think the nomads today produce about a third of all Iran's meat. And that's what this migration is all about. They go in search of grass. Well, there isn't enough grass to keep the herds going through the whole year. So they have their summer and their winter grazing, and they move between the two.
Just a reminder for those listening, you can ask a question by clicking on the Ask Question button under the video screen and then press send. And please tweet using the hashtag IQ2. Tell us more about the Scythians, who are people you cover in the book. Obviously, an ancient Eastern Iranian equestrian nomadic people, but one we know or hear or learn a lot less about, for example, at school, than other ancient populations.
Yes, they're just not on the curriculum. Well, not yet. I mean, they might be, and obviously, I'm trying to put them onto the curriculum. But there was an exhibition in the British Museum had a big show about 5 years ago of the Scythians, and obviously I went to, and it had beautiful, very sophisticated jewelry. Everything about them was fascinating and beautiful. But there was also a conference of all the sort of Scythian experts from around the world at the same time as that exhibition, and just to show you the difficulty of trying to write about these people, trying to study them. So 3 days of conference and papers and whatever. And then what the reality is that we don't even know what they called themselves. We don't know that they called themselves Scythians. But they came off there's this sort of huge steppeland that runs more or less from Hungary to Manchuria, to China. And in the western part, so from here to Kazakhstan, to the Altai Mountains, it's long, flat, grassy, very good for grazing, very good for horses, and it's a bit harsher because it's higher up, Mongolia, and that's a much harder landscape. But this is the great steppe corridor that links the east and the west of Eurasia, this sort of the great land mass of the world. And one by one, because people who live on this on this steppe have always been nomadic, they get either they move down because of climate change, or a warming or a cooling that makes it impossible for them to live up there. So they'll come down either into China or into the West, sometimes into Hungary, sometimes down into the Middle East, or sometimes down into Pakistan and down the Indus River. And when they come, they bring innovation, they bring fresh blood, they bring trouble for the people who are living there already, because they need to settle. And one by one, you have lots and lots of tribes over thousands of years moving down, and the Scythians were one of them. And what we know about the Scythians is that that more or less from the western part from Turkey onwards to the east, to about maybe into Kazakhstan, they controlled a vast amount of territory. They and their other friendly nomadic tribes. And from the middle of there to China, to the Great Wall of China, there was a tribe called the Xiongnu. Again, we don't know what they called themselves, because they certainly didn't call themselves Xiongnu, because it means in Chinese sons of slaves or something like that. So again, we know very little about them. But from about 600 BC to about 300 of the current era, there appears to be this vast territory between the Roman world and the Chinese, or the Han Chinese world, controlled by a confederation of steppes. I actually called it an empire, although we don't know much about their administrative structure. But it seems that because you find similar, one thing they have left behind are these huge graves, which are sort of massive mounds, some of them couple of 100 meters around, with lots and lots of the biggest of them have a lot of horses that were sacrificed when the dead person was being interred. Sometimes you have 2 or 3 different burials in them, and you have women as well as men being buried in grand style, with gold, with cauldrons, with Chinese silks, with animal furs, and also with porcelain. And so you find this in east and west of this huge steppe. So the suggestion is that these people were in touch with each other and trading with each other, and they were connecting. Although neither the Romans or the Chinese acknowledged this, that they were connecting these two worlds. They were the conduit for not just goods but ideas that travel between east and west. But the story we get from the historians is the Chinese built the Great Wall to try and keep the Xiongnu out. And the Romans tried to build a similar wall in the very far east of their empire to keep the Scythians and others out. And of course it fails because walls don't work. We know this. And actually what these people wanted were open markets because they wanted to trade. They had things they couldn't produce on the steppes that they needed from settled people. And this is one of the themes that runs through the book, and it's one of the big one of the big facts of the book, and that is that throughout history, although our history books, if they write about nomads, they present them as people who destroy things. Actually, most of history, settled and nomadic people lived very happily together because they were mutually dependent. They needed each other, and they needed to trade. So the happy times are when the markets are open, and people and the nomads can come to the markets, which are invariably set up by settled people, and trade their goods. And when you have unhappy times, for instance, the Roman Empire falls when the Huns arrive. Well, the Huns arrive because the Romans keep closing the trading posts.
You do address one other very unhappy time in the book, which is the Black Death. And obviously there is the trade routes are one of the elements of that. There's always a habit of blaming outsiders for disease, across human history. How often were nomadic people, were they often blamed? Is there an element of that?
Oh, they were always blamed. There's a wonderful description from Sumer from about 2000 BC, or maybe even earlier, 2500 BC, where there's a Sumerian princess who's fallen in love with a nomad, and her friends are trying to persuade her not to do this. And well, you can't marry him because he's not one of us, and you can't marry him because he wears leather, and you can't marry him because he eats raw meat, and there's this sort of long litany of things a similar list to things you might hear today. And he doesn't know how to say his prayers properly, and when he dies, he won't be buried in a mausoleum with this sort of and you get these stories coming out from deep history. Think of Cain and Abel. It starts with that, really, the mistrust of the settled, of the nomadic, down to our own time. I mean, in our own time, we're very worried about travelers and others. Who are these people? Why have they come? Where have they come from? What do they want from us? And so that plays the whole way through. And sometimes there's a very good reason to be anxious about the arrival of nomads, and I'll come on to the Mongols in a minute. But another story about the Scythians before we're done with them, because the Scythians get bad press for killing the great Persian king, the founder of the Persian Empire, Cyrus the Great. But the story that is recorded by Herodotus and others is very clear, and that is that the Scythians then had a queen, which is to their credit. They definitely allowed women equal status in many affairs. And the Scythian queen, Cyrus is invading Scythian land, and the Scythian queen says, "Don't do it. Don't cross the river. You don't need to do this. We don't need to fight." And he says, well, he wants the Scythians to pay respect to him because he thinks he's the ruler of the world. And the Persians do cross the river, and a great fight ensues, and Cyrus loses his head. And so the Persians were not very impressed with that. And so jump forward about 50 years to Darius the Great, the next great Persian emperor. And he tries to do the same. He invades Scythia. And by then there's a Scythian king. This is something I love. So the Scythians just won't confront this enormous Persian army, which might be 700,000, might be more. They just keep moving away. They just move across the land further and further until eventually, and Darius's supply lines are getting more and more stretched, and winter is coming, and he's getting worried. So he sends a very fast messenger after the Scythian king to say, "Why won't you fight? I mean, either fight or pay me tribute as your lord." And the Scythian king says, "Why would we fight? We have no cities that you might destroy. We have no crops that you might burn. We have nothing to worry about." And so they just kept on moving. And eventually the Persians gave up and went home. It's sort of, it's just a brilliant clash of not of civilizations, but of ideas of how one might be. the Persians moving with all their gold and glitter and women and heavy baggage and whatever, and the Scythians just lightly moving ahead of them, think we don't need to fight. It's okay. But sorry.
No, I was going to say, you prompted me to ask about Genghis Khan. So obviously,
yes.
whose name really does resonate, and obviously known as being a sort of a vengeful killer, and also sexually, prolific, I suppose would be a word.
Yes, yes.
What do we misunderstand in that portrayal of Genghis Khan? And is there much more that we should know?
There's much more we should know. Genghis Khan, comes out of a small tribe in Mongolia. If you've read Colin Thubron's The Amur River, which came out last year or this year, then that starts at the Amur River, which is the 10th longest river in the world. Starts it's originally called the Onon River, and that's the heartland of the Mongol people. And that's where Genghis Khan comes out of, but always goes back to it. Karakorum, the famous Mongol city, is not far from there. But he comes out of this small tribe, and he's fighting, but he has a vision, which is sort of inspired by, he's a sky worshipper. He worships the Sky Father, which is a typical Indo-European religion. You worship all the elements, and the Sky Father, which then plays out in Christianity as our Father who art in heaven. He's still in the sky. Genghis Khan has the idea that it was in his destiny and ordained by the Sky Father that he should rule the world. And so he built from his very, very small power base of sort of several hundred people, a coalition until there are millions of them. And he builds this Mongol empire, which stretches from China again to the West. And he becomes the most powerful person in the world. This is 1100s into the early 1200s of our time. And, think about English history at this time. I mean, it's not our most glorious period. We've come out of the Dark Ages, but the Crusades are going on, and Renaissance is still a long way in the distance. So you have this man who has done what nobody else in the world is doing at that time, and he creates the largest empire the world has ever seen, enormous. And he does it the way that it was done at that time, and probably still is done if you look at what's happening to the east of Europe at the moment, with warfare. Warfare was not pretty. The Crusades were not pretty. What our great Christian warriors did was not pretty. But there's a reason for the sort of absolute horror blitz approach that Genghis Khan has when he's approaching people. He always offered peace. Give in to me, and I won't destroy your cities, and you can pay your tribute, and you can go around living as you lived before. And if people resisted, then he attacked. But it had to be quick, because the Mongols were very bad at siege warfare, because they're nomads, and they have each Mongol fighter has several horses. That's a lot. If you've got hundreds of thousands of riders, that's millions of horses. What are they going to eat? So you can't stay in one place for very long. They have to keep on moving. And so the idea of, why he killed so many people in certain places was that, firstly, they hadn't accepted his offer of paying tribute to him. And so he went to war, and he went to war as quickly and as savagely as he could, so that the next people down the line would understand that it was in their interest to give up very quickly, but it was also in the interest of the nomads as well. Not that I'm an apologist for Genghis Khan; he did kill millions of people, but also great things came out of this. This is a time when most of Europe is absolutely closed, but what Genghis Khan sets up and is followed, 100 and something years later by one of his successors, Tamerlane, or as we sometimes call him, Emir Timur, who comes out of the same Mongol stock, is a sort of a massive open Central Asia, open for trade. This is the beginning of this really great flourishing of the Silk Roads. So linking, they're open for, so you have freedom of movement, you have freedom of conscience as well. I mean, he's not interested in, it doesn't matter whether you're a Christian, a Muslim, and Karakoram, the city that he found, well, in fact, in his own life, it's really just a tent city, but one of his successors builds it up into a proper settled town, city. It has churches of various denominations, it has mosques, and they're still praying to Sky Father and to the elements, and basically it didn't matter. And then they become Buddhists, and it doesn't, that's of no interest. Everybody is welcome. So long, the important thing is free movement and free trade. So they made trade tariffs very low. They were sort of early Keynesian economists. I think they wanted to see their money moving. There's a moment where one of the Mongol Khans, who we all know, Kublai Khan, goes into the imperial treasury and sees all this gold and silver and says, "What's this doing? Give it away. It has to keep moving, and it'll come back to us, sort of tenfold." So that was very much and they set up, following the Roman example and before that the Persian example. They set up highways. I mean, obviously not paved as we would understand them, but clear routes the whole way across Central Asia, where it was said that if you were a young girl, you could walk with a gold bowl on your head and nobody would trouble you. Well, they wouldn't trouble you because the punishments were so extreme. And later on, they build a series of hostels where if you have the right coin, if you've been approved to stay in the hostels, you're going to get bed and board and a fresh mount. And if you have the golden coin, you're going to get silk sheets. You're going to get a real feast. It's a 5-star hotel. And this side of Genghis Khan is just not known at all. And out of this comes, out of all these Mongol movements, east and west, does come the Black Death, which is absolutely devastating, obviously. Although it's still not quite clear where it came from, but it may well have come. I mean, it certainly came from somewhere in Central Asia. But also comes all of the foundations for the Renaissance, all of the ideas, and for instance, paper brought by Mongols from China, and gunpowder, which obviously the Europeans scale up and turn into lots and lots of deadly weapons, whereas the Chinese initially had it for their religious festivals. And the compass, all these are brought as long time before the taming of the horse, riding horses and the bridle and the chariot. All those came off the steppes, brought by nomads.
Well, I wanted to touch on that because this is a theme throughout the book, that the ability to ride was a revolution, the equine revolution, and perhaps we don't think enough about quite how much that changed things.
Well, it's interesting. We're now moving away from the combustion engine slowly, but we will, as our means of transport. And Wilfrid Thesiger, who himself was rather partial to nomads, who I went to talk to in his old age when I was just beginning to travel, used to call the combustion engine the sort of curse of mankind. And he spent his last years trying to find people who weren't touched by it. But if you think the combustion engine, will maybe have lasted 150 years by the time it's extinct, the horse was the mode of transport for thousands and thousands of years. The New York Fire Brigade was still using horses to pull their fire trucks at the beginning of the beginning of the last century. So, you've got thousands and thousands of years. It's the most successful means of transport, apart from our own feet, that we've ever had. And that's, that came off the Eurasian steppe, and it was brought by, well, firstly achieved by Mongols, also brought by nomads. So yeah, I mean, that's, it's fascinating, and there are some great books on the horse that to be read that are in my bibliography, and that's the whole story of how it shaped our world.
Now, I made you an apologist a little bit for Genghis Khan. So what about Attila the Hun? Let's do both.
Attila.
His name. There's a really interesting line in the book that I loved, which is he recognized that a ruler of an empire must build a house, banqueting hall, and council chamber, but his were made of wood and so could be dismantled. So he's going around sort of setting it up everywhere. So there's a challenge here for him of balancing all those sort of the mobile traditions alongside the need for a capital city to have a proper empire. Tell us about Attila.
Yeah. Well, Attila he was probably born in Hungary, so his tribe came off the steppes, but he himself was brought up more or less in a settled environment. But he's certainly part of the nomadic tradition, and he chose to identify himself and to live in a nomadic way. So, as you say, he recognizes he needs a capital. But first of all, he only comes west of the Danube, which was one of the sort of empire. And this is in the early 400s of our era, because of global warming, climate change, and there was a problem of tribes on the steppes, one after the other. The Goths, the Huns, and lots of others came because of this need for grazing, and they cross over the Danube. The Roman emperor at the time, Valens, was very keen for them not to, and then recognized he couldn't stop them, so he allowed, for instance, the Goths initially to settle in Thrace in Greece. But the problem with it for Attila was he wanted to come in, wanted to trade, and the Romans kept closing the trading posts, and each time they did that, he would invade and cause immense distress and destroy vast numbers of Roman legions, and then he would get what he wanted. But he didn't necessarily want the Roman Empire. I mean, not initially. And so when, each time he'll go another incursion into the Roman Empire, and he'll destroy a city, and then he'll pull back to his land, because what he wanted was an open market. And eventually more and more he wanted tribute, because he recognized that he was stronger than the Romans. He could defeat the great Roman armies. The tributes get bigger. There's a wonderful description from one of the Roman ambassadors to a man called Priscus, who goes to see Attila. And so we have first-hand description of this great ruler. And what strikes Priscus is that Attila is a family man. He's presented, with his son sitting beside him, and he's clearly very affectionate to them. His wife and the only fixed building in the entire city of Attila, which still hasn't been found, we rely on Priscus's description for it, was the bathhouse that Attila built for one of his wives, or his chief wife, which couldn't be dismantled. I think that was out of stone, but everything else was, you could take it down and move with it. And but he's clearly a man who, Priscus sits there thinking, wow, this is a man who's famous for his savagery, and yet he's actually quite modest. He controls a large chunk of the world. He's immensely wealthy, and Priscus is given a gold platter to eat off, and everybody else is eating off gold, and they're all eating fancy food. But Attila is there with his wooden bowl, eating straightforward meat, straight out of the nomad world. Drinking fermented mare's milk, and he's a nomad at heart, and he only gets pulled further and further into the Roman world because the Romans keep on opposing him and won't give him what he wants, which is the right to trade. So eventually, he effectively brings down the Western Roman Empire and reduces the Eastern one around Byzantium, Constantinople, to a very small part. But it's interesting, because had he lived a little bit longer, Attila, he may well have settled somewhere. He never lived to take Rome. He defeated another massive Roman army in a sort of devastating battle. But then he died. And I think, because this is the case with several of them, I think he died after because he took another bride and another massive bridal banquet and night in bed with a younger woman, and had a heart attack. I think that was the end of Genghis Khan. But had he not done that, had he lived, he may well have taken Rome. And had he taken Rome, he may well have settled there. But up until then, there was this sort of unfinished business. So he wasn't going to settle. He was restless. He still had things to do.
Now, we're coming up to when we'll switch over to questions. So just a reminder that you can ask a question by clicking on the Ask Question button under the video screen, then press send. And I can see we've already got in. We've only just got started.
We've only just started.
Well, what I was going to say, I haven't even touched on the Native Americans. And you can book about Benjamin Franklin, the founding father, and puzzled why people wanted to live in that way. What happened when the founding fathers met the Native Americans in terms of these very different lifestyles? And was that, I mean, obviously we know there was a huge disaster for the Native Americans, but the nomad lifestyle clearly was a real clash.
It was, and I mean, obviously, not all of the Native Americans were nomadic, but many of them were. But it's fascinating because Benjamin Franklin, who's living in the settlement of Pennsylvania, can't understand why settlers who've been captured by the Native Americans and live with them for a while and then being brought back into the settlement won't stay. Given the first opportunity, and this is not just men, but women as well, they'll go back into what he called a wandering life. And the reverse applies as well, and that is that Native American children who are being offered free education in the great schools of the settlements were very loath to come. And there's a meeting between the Native American elders and the elders from the settlement, and the Native Americans say, "Well, we sent some kids to you, and when they came back to us, they were good for absolutely nothing. Why would we do it again?" And Franklin is fascinated because he said, with all the advantages of arts and sciences, why is this the case? And it comes down to the fact he realizes you have to work a lot harder and longer to make your living in a settlement than you do out in the natural world with the people who move around. And obviously the ease, he's clearly from the day he was born, he was going to work every moment, every day till he died, and he achieved enormous things. But he doesn't understand there are people who would just be quite happy just to hang out and live well, and he just doesn't get it at all. So it's a complete misunderstanding on both sides.
Let's turn to we've got some great questions. So I'll start with Isabel's question. Do you think that the creation of settled civilizations was essentially a mistake? Would we be happier and healthier if we still lived in small groups on the hoof? We might be happier, according to what you've just said.
Well, we might be healthier as well. That's for sure as well. Would we be? No, I think there are some people who would be much happier on the move. And the challenge now, I mean, there are vast numbers of people, for instance, in the United States who live in what they call wheel estate rather than real estate. They live out of a truck, a van, or whatever, and it's really a counterculture. And the film Nomadland touched on that. So these are people who literally are rootless, although they do gather at several places in several fixed times of the year, sort of as all tribes tend to do. But would we be happy? Yeah, it really depends on who you are. I mean, some of us have clearly evolved. I mean, I know my mother would have been absolutely miserable. I mean, grass was something of a challenge for her. So she needed somewhere where her heels were not going to sink into the ground and where there were no creepy crawly things. Nomad life, and also she liked to travel with a lot of luggage. So nomad life would not be for her. But I think, and this is one of the really big ideas behind the book, and that is, we are living at a time of immense social, cultural, political change. And I think that the world that came into being at the time of the Enlightenment is, this Western-dominated world is coming to an end, and we're on the way to something else. And it might be that there are ideas that we can draw down from a lighter way of living, from a living in tune with the natural world, which nomads are obliged to do because they're absolutely at its mercy, and which we in cities find very easy to forget. You go to the supermarket and you only notice where things come from when they're not there. It's like, what do you mean? And then you realize that Brexit stopped the supply of French cheese or something, or whatever it was. But otherwise, we don't even have to think about these things. And I think a lot of people would be much happier living a simpler life on the move, yes.
But one thing that you do say in the book, there's a sort of theme across different populations where it's sort of soft land breeds soft men. And they have this idea that, the third or fourth generation, when they start settling behind walls, they give into luxury and then they lose touch with the people. So there's two things there. If we had a more nomadic lifestyle, would we have a more equal society? And then the flip side of that is there is bits of this life that are really, really hard, surely.
Yeah, there are, and this idea you've mentioned is from the Arab philosopher Ibn Khaldun, 14th, early 15th century, and he believes that he's an Arab, so he looks at the Arab Empire and he looks further back into deep history, and he's seen kingdoms. He's living in North Africa come and go, and they've all been founded and initially by nomadic peoples. And so he divides people into different categories, and he describes the purest people as the people who live in the desert, because they are untouched by the needless desires of people who live in the city. And he, as you say, he describes, that many empires are created by people who've come out of either the desert or the mountains or off the steppes, and have that initial force, which is dissipated by settlement and by softened by palace life, and there, yes, as you say, 3-4 generations, and things are on the slide. And also, because you live in a settled place and in a palace, you lose touch with the people who gathered around you and allowed you to create the thing in the first place. And there's very much a sense in this of a renewal that carried on throughout the world. The world was effectively refreshed by nomads coming until we invented machine guns and things like that, which no amount of sort of nomad valor and vigor was going to get past cannons and the Maxim gun and things. Does that answer the question?
It does. And I love this next question, which I think I know what you're going to say. Are the super rich who travel the world and never stay put anywhere very long the new nomads? Excellent question.
Yes. Well, okay. The word nomad, very, very, very old Indo-European word, and it literally means, in its original form, nomos, means somebody who goes in search of pasture, or somebody who has the right to graze their herd on a particular patch of land. But we live in the 21st century, and as my book moves forward, I do shift the meaning of the word nomad. And yeah, there are people who live on the move now, who digital nomads and others who are, they're not grazing. They're not coming with their sheep or their goats or whatever, or their horses. But in many, many respects, they are living exactly that way. And there's a lovely story that Bruce Chatwin wrote about a man who he thought was a pure nomad, and that he was an English salesman who traveled around Africa with a suitcase, flight to flight, hotel to hotel, and the only solid fixed point in his life was a box that was in a locker in London, and if he wanted to put something into the box because the box was full, he would have to throw something away. And Chatwin thought, this is a man not only who has something to teach us, those of us who acquire too many things to be happy, but also in terms of moving around. So yeah, I think I don't mind people calling themselves digital nomads or others. It's fine.
We haven't talked much about religion and how it interacts with nomadism. This question is sort of asking about that. Is there a particular kind of religion that nomads tend to follow? They obviously can't build temples or altars to their gods, and that's from Stella.
Well, they do. They do build shrines, and in fact, many of the shrines that then turn into temples that then turn into cities. And I'm thinking, for instance, of Ur in Mesopotamia, which is now Iraq, or even Baghdad. These places were initially somewhere that nomads passed by and left a mark because it was sacred for some reason that we can't maybe quite understand today, because we've lost that initial knowledge, and then they evolve and they become, it's a temple, and then around the temple will evolve a village, a town, and a city. But I open the book with it, and this is quite contentious, with a place called Gobekli Tepe in Turkey, which was built around 9,500 BC and is one of, if not the oldest, built stone monument in the world. Imagine a big circle of pillars that are about T-shaped pillars that are about 10, 12 feet high, with two bigger ones in the middle. There's about 12 on the outside, and there's lots and lots of circles on a hillside. And it seems to have been that initially this was a nomadic initiative, because of something that we can't understand, something sacred in that place. So, and because they were almost all nomads were in touch with the natural world, and therefore with what they believed to be the spirits of the world, as we did in Europe until 1,000 years ago. We all would have watched the shadows as we moved across a field because of the spirits that would be living in it. I mean, that was a given with all humans. We did away with it. Many nomads didn't, and they still have that sense of the sacredness of certain places. So yeah, I think that religion has been important. But as I mentioned, certainly with the Mongols and the sort of great Mongol Renaissance that precedes the European Renaissance, it doesn't matter whether you're a Muslim, a Jew, a Christian, a Buddhist, or an atheist. It was not important. And there's a lovely story of a Christian friar going to see, I think it's Genghis Khan, and he's already been blessed by the Muslims, and it's like, okay, well, you might as well come and bless me as well. If it works, it works. It's fine.
You've actually got a question about the place in Turkey you mentioned. What do we know about the people who built it? And is it true that they're the same ones who buried it? And forgive me for not saying it. I was terrified I'd mispronounce it.
Gobekli Tepe. We don't know very much about it. It was only uncovered in the 1990s by a wonderful man called Klaus Schmidt, and in the late 90s he started excavating, and they're still excavating today. And they found other similar sites from the same sort of period in that area, and I'm sure there's a lot more to be discovered. So we really don't know very much about them, except my understanding is that they were people who moved, hunter-gatherers, who were following the movement of game, because at that point all that area of Turkey, what's now was savanna. So they would have been moving, and there's one particular place where this temple is, where Gobekli Tepe is, which is a gully. So if you were going to chase game into a trap, that would be a perfect place. And they found lots and lots and lots of game bones there from, and then as things went on, they obviously ate everything there was to be eaten around there, and because they kept on coming back to it because they were building this place. And then you have the beginning of cultivation. So Gobekli Tepe might actually be the place that the agricultural evolution starts, because the first strain of domesticated wheat was found about 25 miles away.
Oh, how interesting. Okay, we've got a question from Marie Christine. I'm fascinated by the Scythians, and she's been to visit one of their burial sites. I wanted to ask if there are any descendants of the Scythians living today.
Oh, good question. Well, perhaps if there are any who are listening in, they could make themselves known to you now. Hands up, anybody who's a Scythian. I don't know. I don't know. Yes, inevitably there must be. Genetically, there must be, obviously, as there are. I mean, you mentioned Genghis Khan and his sexual proclivity. I can't remember, but there's a significant amount of his DNA has been spread around the world.
Yeah,
yeah, exactly. So yeah, there must be Scythian DNA in the world as well. Must be.
Did nomads enslave other people?
Yes, everybody did. I mean, it depends what you call enslaving. I mean, they drove them forwards into in battle. You'd often use the captured enemies as to draw the first fire. And yeah, we have very good records of Timur or Tamerlane as he moved his way through the Middle East, and particularly this moment where I describe, which I talked about, where he meets Ibn Khaldun, this great historian and sociologist, and we know that a huge number of people were sent east by Timur, but these were people who had skills, who had, they were craftspeople, because he was building these beautiful cities of Samarkand and others in the east with Genghis Khan. And so, for instance, in Karakorum, in its first iteration, there was a famous Parisian jeweler who'd been captured and had been enslaved and sent to Karakorum Karakoram because all of the best workmen were going there, because that was effectively the center of the world at that point. It was the capital of the richest empire in the world, and so obviously they wanted to bring the best that they could get to it. But what was interesting is that a Christian priest from Europe, goes and finds this Parisian jeweler and offers him, he said, "I'll buy you your freedom." And he says, no, I'm quite happy where I am, thank you. And I worked out, he was being paid millions of pounds, the equivalent of millions of pounds today, to build beautiful things for the nomads. So he had started out a slave, and I'm sure that the story for many, many people was absolutely miserable. But some of them, with a lot of people, there was a desire to use the skills. And it's the same with scholars. The nomads are often accused of destroying libraries, but that's certainly not my understanding of it. They moved libraries, yes, and they moved a lot of the scholars, and particularly to do with astrology, astronomy, because they were very much directed by the movement of stars and signs and portents. So in the same way that London in the beginning of the 20th century, the world's great city, we attracted all sorts of people. We didn't bring them as slaves, but we attracted them here. And it was exactly the same with the nomads, except, they were enslaved. The same way that most feudal people were enslaved as well.
We haven't talked too much about language. Christine Robinson asked, do nomadic people usually have their own unique language?
No, they may well have done a long, long time ago, but not anymore. No. They, the Bakhtiari. They in Iran, who I spent some time with. They have their dialect, but effectively they're speaking. They speak the same language as most other people in Iran.
So I think you will disagree strongly with this question. Do you agree that some scholars have exaggerated the importance of nomads throughout history? Much recent DNA and archaeological evidence shows that demographic and linguistic change happened not so much through one group of people on the move, invading the territory of another, but through trade and other forms of cultural contact.
Well, yes and no, because I think trade and those other forms of cultural contact are very, very, very often happen because of the people who live between two fixed points. And for instance, I get excited about the Scythians and the Xiongnu because they are the mobile part, counterpart to the Han Chinese and the Romans, and they are the ones who move things from side to side. We don't know of any Chinese trader who ever made it to the Roman court, and we don't know of any Roman who made it to the Chinese court, and yet we know that they were trading with each other. I can't remember, one of the might be Cicero or one of the great Roman writers complaining about how much of the national wealth is being spent on Chinese silk, so women can flirt and whatever. It happens because nomads are in between, and it's the same with what I call the Mongol Renaissance. This great flourishing, the Pax Mongoliana, the peace that they bring about is just as great and just as far-reaching in terms of consequences for the world as the Roman one. And they bring about the connection between East and West. They are the link between the world, and it wouldn't have happened with settled people. And so yes and no is my answer. I agree and I fully disagree. And I don't think you can't overestimate the influence of nomads in global history, because it's mostly either ignored or completely played down and marginalized as these are bloodthirsty killers. So no, we need more.
Saul has got an excellent question that brings us up to the current day. Did you have any contact with modern day travelers and Roma when you were writing your book?
Travelers and Roma, no, I didn't. I assume you mean the European ones. No, my experiences are all in Africa and Asia, not in Europe. Although I did see some of the transhumants in southern France, where they move the herds between summer and winter pasture. But no, I think that firstly, there's a brilliant book that still applies from Isabel Fonseca about the Roma, and the title is something like "Bury My Heart" or something like that, and it's beautiful and wonderful. And I think she wrote it about 15 years ago, maybe longer, but it's still absolutely poignant and to the point. But I think that they're a good example of, and there are many, many others. I mean, when obviously I could have gone on researching this book forever, for several more lifetimes. And everywhere I went, I met people who'd say, oh, you should come too. And for instance, I remember sitting in Isfahan in Iran, and I met a woman from Bulgaria who said, we still have nomads in the mountains who are still speaking Greek. You know, the Greek of Homer. And if you come, I'm going to show you, I'll take you to meet them. And I think Paddy Lee Fermor wrote about them when he was traveling through Eastern Europe. But how much can you do? I mean, this book, it already took 8 years of my life. You know, it's enough. It's enough.
But do you think some of the same, I think what perhaps Saul was interested in, does some of the same themes apply in how we treat the traveller community in Britain and in other parts of Europe as how they've been treated across history?
Oh, absolutely. It's absolutely the same. And that is, you know, a mistrust and ascribing all sorts of terrible things to them, which they're people. People everywhere do good things and bad things. And so I'm sure the Roma and travelers do as well, but they also do good things. But it comes out of this sense of, oh my God, why have they come? Why have they come here? What are they doing? And when will they go? And governments here, I mentioned, you know, that in Iran that they're very keen, and I saw this in Egypt as well with the Bedou, wanting to settle people, and that's what we want to do here with ours. But I think there is an absolutely essential function that nomadic and mobile people perform for us who live between fixed walls, and I think we should recognise that.